Okay, so hopefully my voice holds up for the class period, but we'll give her a go. So last time we were in the middle of making our code do some stuff. Let me just comment this out here real quick and see what our code currently is doing. I recall that we had the dude chasing us around the room. Okay. So what we want to do is we already have something put in here with a trigger. So we were talking about triggers last time, how they are like collisions, but physics don't play into them. Like right now, my collision that's existing with this guy has physics. So when I bump him around and he, moves, physics is being applied. But if I take an empty game object like we have, actually, I don't think it's an empty game object. I think it's actually this room trigger here. Click on this good guy. So what do I have that guy set up as? All right, so he is a cube. Oh, he currently has his mesh renderer turned on. But he's only in one of the things. So we have a box collider. Let me take a look one more time. So I don't think I saw white boxes anywhere. So this is our room prefab that has these guys in it. And right now our room trigger is this, it's a cube with the intent that the mesh renderer is turned off. Although right now I don't see the mesh renderer being turned off in here, but it is turning off out here. Oh, maybe I just hadn't saved. So in any case, this is the current state of things where the trigger we've created is actually housed inside of this cube. This cube that, if we look at it like this, is not a very good idea. But what I want to have happen is I want to go into this room trigger and I want to just turn the renderer off. If I turn the renderer off, it's still there. We just can't see it. It's not being rendered on the screen. So now we have something that looks like this. And that trigger is still happening. Now our accuracy is going to be a little bit sketch here because, I don't necessarily come through these doors super cleanly. So there could be a situation where I enter one room by hitting the trigger and then immediately enter the other one. And I guess there could be a situation where I'm technically in two rooms at once, but we can burn that bridge later. But it's less about perfect accuracy here and more about using our singleton. Okay, so we have that room trigger now. And remember, that guy is set up as a box collider with the is trigger clicked. So that means that he's not going to put physics onto whoever bumps into him. He's just allowing us to programmatically respond to him. And let's see, that's going to be on our, well, presumably our room script. Put this error back in just for a second so I don't forget where we're at. This is in player. So we need to have a way for a player to get the room that they're currently in and then let the player know things between rooms. So let me go back in here and a room, maybe room trigger. Yeah, room trigger has a room trigger script. So there is a script that is associated with that trigger. And that has to be right here. All right. So this is where we have the on trigger enter. So this is the code that gets called by that whenever another object bumps into that trigger, our box collider that's not being rendered, this function will get called, and we're asking a question here. We want to know if it's the player, then we're saying the player into the room. If it's the enemy, we're saying the enemy enter the room. So we're able to tell the difference between the player and the enemy.
And you're not sharing your screen.
Yeah, you're not sharing your screen.
It took you this long to tell me that?
Someone said in the chat.
Oh, well, I don't look at chat. I barely have working eyes right now. Are you sure I'm not sharing the screen? I really thought I did. Oh, no, I started recording though. All right, you can see the screen now?
Yep.
All right. Just as the quick thing, I'll turn the renderer back on so you see what happens, what I already showed. Oh, I need to take that compiler back out. All right, so as of right now, the those boxes are our actual triggers. And remember, I made them tall like that because I cheat and I make my guy fly. But these guys are still triggers, so they're not being impacted. And you can see down here that the enemy is entering these different rooms. This is all happening because that enemy, even though we can't necessarily see him because we have these boxes blocking us, he is trying to get towards us using our nav mesh that we set up last time. So obviously we wouldn't want this to look this way, but this is our design for it. So our fix for this is just to go in and in our prefab for room, just unclick the renderer. It's still there. We still have a box collider. The box collider is still a trigger. We just don't see it. And now we have the look that we wanted. And we see that our enemy can move between rooms. And then if I move the player, we see right here, where's my player guy? Player entered a room right here. So we're able to differentiate between who entered a room, who interacted with that trigger. And that's happening through this room trigger script. So on trigger enter right here, this guy gets called every single time something interacts with that box collider. And if it was the player, we'll do one thing. If it's the enemy, we'll do something else. If it's something else, which we don't have right now, it's not going to do anything. So we're only doing it under those circumstances. Okay. So in my error that I put in here, we wanted to, just like we had in our mud from before, we want to be able to set a player's room and also get a player's room. So a player is associated with the room they're currently in. So we see here in our player object, and remember, these are plain Jane Java objects. Class player, this is not a mono behavior. So this is just a normal, well, in this case, it's a C# object, but just a normal object that we are using to keep track of what is happening on the screen behind the scenes. So in like our model view controller, this would be the controller. Actually, you know what? This would probably be the closest to the model side of things. We're storing our data here inside of these objects. The controllers would be our mono behavior scripts, and then our views would be our dudes we see on the screen. So I think we probably have gotten into the model part of that now, because this player object is kind of keeping track of what's actually happening on the screen, so we can programmatically do stuff with it. All right, so a player knows how to remember their current room. When a player is first born, they don't have a current room. We're going to have the ability to set a player's room to the current room. Now we want to have the ability to get a room, ask a player for their current room. this is room. All right, so a player now has the ability to set their room and the ability to get their room. Now, we want to set their room whenever a player interacts with a particular trigger. So going back here. What we'd like to have happen is when this player first comes into existence, his room is set to whatever room he's currently in. When he moves into this room, now his room's set to this room that he's currently in. So on and so forth. So at any point in time, we should be able to ask the player, what room are you currently in? And he should be able to give you some information about that. And then there's my cheat mode. So good. All right, so that's what we'd like to have happen. So we need to decide, how do we make it so that when this game first starts, this player that dropped into this room knows that his current room is this room. And this comes down to, how do we want to programmatically represent a room? Visually, a room is our room prefab right here, where we see all the walls and we know there's this giant trigger box in here that we have the renderer turned off for. But we have to say, well, what is a room? If we go back to our prefab for our room, the room prefab itself doesn't have any scripts associated with it, but the trigger itself does. The trigger, this is the one thing that is in our room that actually has a script associated with it. So would it be fair for us to say that in our map here, every single room has a trigger, and every single trigger is a representation of that room, can kind of hold on to that room object? Is that what really makes this guy a room? From our perspective right now, we need rooms to be able to remember each other. So what we would do, and it was possible we already did it. Go back into here. We go to our room trigger script. Yeah, looks like we did do it. So our room trigger is going to hold on to an instance of a room object. Remember, room objects are plain Jane C# objects, not mono behaviors. All right, so this is keeping track of our data associated with our dudes dancing around the screen, not something that's going to have that update every single frame or anything like that. So when a room trigger script is first born, and it's born when one of our triggers is instantiated, which happens once for every room, we're going to go ahead and instantiate a new room. And when a new room is born, a room keeps track of the player that might be in the room. Initially, when a room is born, it does not have a player in it. So the player is equal to null. A room has the ability to set its player, and a room has the ability to get its player from a room. Okay. Now I do want to look at something here real quick before we go any further in. I'm going to go ahead and run this. I want to see, does the player interact with the room right off the bat? Looks like they did, but let me just confirm. Yeah, they did. I just wanted to make sure that this player was hitting this trigger the very first time. That way we have a way of initially setting that player's room. All right, so when a room is first born, we set its player to null. When a room trigger is first born as part of our room prefab, it's going to instantiate an empty room object that is a room that has a null player. But then he has this function called onTriggerEnter. So if the player just entered the room, we want to set this room's player equal to the player object associated with let's just say the player actor. So visually, what do I want to have happen? When this player drops into this room and the room becomes, or the trigger for the room becomes aware that the player has entered the room, we want this triggers room object to become aware that this player is now in there. So my question is how do we accomplish that? Maybe the starting point is who knows about the player object? Let's go back and look at our player here. Here's our player script. A player script knows about the player. He creates an instance of player. In this case, our player's name is Mike. He can keep track of the number of kills and all that crap. He can move the player around and stuff. But at this point, the only entity in our game that knows about our instance of player is our player script. So if the script associated with my player object here, if the script that's attached to this guy knows about my player instance, and the trigger that's associated with each of these rooms knows about the room instance associated with that room, how do we let a room know about the player that's currently in it? Any suggestions? How we can let this room trigger know about this player? And similarly, once this player moves to this room, have this room trigger forget about that player, and this room now know about that player. How do we make various room triggers know about our player object? Any suggestions for me?
Could I forget what it was called, the on trigger when player enters a room, add it to a list of players in that trigger?
Okay, well, we only have one player right now. I mean, you're thinking ahead in case we have multiple players. I get it.
Yes.
So we have one player, and you're saying, well, can we just add it to a list of players for the trigger? Or in the updated version of that, can we just add it to an object in the trigger called the player, right?
Yeah.
We have that in here already. We have, actually, we don't have, the room trigger doesn't know about that, but we can go ahead and we can say private player, current player. And when a room is first born, we'll set current player equal to null. But then we should have the ability to add a player to this room. When do we want to add a player to this room? Whenever a player enters the trigger. That's when a player should enter this room. So the question is how, inside of this if statement, how do we get access to that player object? There is an instance of the player object that exists right now. It was born inside of player script right here. When player script first launched, and player script is only attached to that single player object. When he's first born, this instance is created. And right now, the only guy who knows about the player is my player script. But now we are inside of room trigger script, and we notice that something that is a player just wandered in. I want this room, the room that this guy controls, I want him to know about what player is currently in there. So it's actually not the room trigger that knows about the current player. It'll be the room that is in that guy. So this room, he's the guy that would know about the current player in the room. not the trigger script itself. So the better question here is inside of this if statement, how do we talk about the current instance of the player? How do we get access to Mike from within here? I'm currently in room trigger script, yet Mike was born inside of player script. Mike is a local field inside of player script. He's a private local field inside of player script, and I need to somehow get access to him inside of my room trigger script inside of this if statement.
We could use a getter in player script.
Yeah, I was gonna say dot get.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and put that in here, then you tell me how we're going to use it, and then we'll notice that we're going to still have a problem. So you want to have a public player get player, something like that, and then return this dot the player. So we've, he wants to have a getter, so now we've given ourselves public access to this private variable. All right, reasonable enough approach. Nothing wrong with this. Okay, so now we've given ourselves public access to that private player. How do you want to use it? In order to use that public access, we need to have access to the player script, right? Does this guy here know about the player script? I think we can all guess.
No, but couldn't we include it?
Okay, so you're suggesting, well, why don't we just add a player script to this guy? So that's for our room trigger. We go back here, and in our room trigger, we add a component, and we add a player script to this guy. This will be a second instance of player script. Specifically, this will be an instance of player script. To remember, player scripts allow us to move around. So all of a sudden, we'll be able to move our triggers around. So we'll be driving those dudes. If we don't turn if we turn collisions on, then they're going to be real stationary, like extremely stationary. But any way you cut it, us adding player script to this guy creates a second instance of player script, where really it's the original player script that knows about the player we want. Okay, so that's not going to cut it. Right before break, we were talking about design patterns, right? Remind me, what's the Singleton design pattern used for? Or what's the definition of the Singleton design pattern? And by the way, that's going to be the correct answer to this question, is to use the Singleton design pattern. So let's remind ourselves what that dude's for. Anybody remember what the Singleton design pattern is for? Singleton design pattern. It's a good idea to have data that multiple instances of an object need access to, stored in a single place, rather than pass that data to each individual object. So we've looked at two different design patterns so far. We've looked at Singleton and we looked at MVC. MVC is our model view controller. We've seen that a whole bunch of times with how does Unity accomplish that? We've built a Singleton into our code already. We have this thing called core. Okay, remember, if we go back to our Unity thing here, just get out of my prefab. I have an empty game object just sitting here. It's just like this this leader of the he's an invisible entity in this room, and we attached our core script to this guy. And so this guy has this core script, and our core script is a mono behavior, but he's only a mono behavior because we needed to have him attached to a game object, and we can only attach scripts to game objects that are mono behaviors. But inside here, what are we doing? We have a bunch of static things here. We can add a room, add all this other stuff, yada, yada, yada. So what we can do is we can say private static player, current player. start this guy off at null. And then we can do something like public static void set player. And we'll set core's current player equal to that. Remember, this is a static method, so we don't actually need to say core dot, because since this is a static means it's owned by the class, and this method's also, or this field's also owned by the class, the context that we're in inside here is as if we're talking about things inside of the core class. I'm still an advocate of always typing out the name of the class. So even though core dot is optional here, I still like to type it. So now we know how to use our singleton to set the player. And when will we do that? As soon as a player is born, let's let core know about him. Where is a player born? He's born inside of player script right here. So we'll let core know about the player that we just created. So even though player is this local variable that belongs to this player script, we've given a pointer to him to core. Now our room trigger script, he can yell up at core and say, hey, I need to move the player. He's no longer in the other room. He's in this room now. Whatever. Okay. So from this room trigger perspective, sorry, let me go back to core because we need to give ourselves the ability to get a player as well. So public static player get player return core dot player. All right, so there's my getter and setter around these private fields. Based on the way I'm written these, we might as well have made this guy public because I'm not giving any oversight between them, but maybe we will put some oversight in there. So this is probably still better programming practice because at the very least, we are wrapping our private fields in public methods where we at the very least were given the opportunity to decide, well, do I want to just directly set whatever this guy gives me to my current player, or might I want to ask a question about this guy beforehand? We have the opportunity if we wanted to ask a question in here, even though we're currently not doing that. All right, so now through our singleton, through core, we can set the player, we can also get the player. When are we setting the player? As soon as a player is born inside a player script, he's instantiated right there, we let core know about him, which then means if I'm in the room trigger script and I'm in this if statement, I can now get the player that just entered this room. So the player that just entered this room is core.getPlayer. This is the dude that just entered the room because we only have one player in our game. Now you might say, well, can't we just get the collider that entered the room? That's kind of what we're talking about here. The collider that entered our room here, he is this player object. He is the physical embodiment of our player. He's not the logic behind the player. He's not the data of our player. So effectively, the collider is this circle or the sphere rather that's rolling around the thing. It's useless to us other than visual. We're keeping track of the crap behind the scene about which room is this physical thing in, and we know that by keeping track of where the code behind of this guy lives. So when something enters this particular room trigger, we want to get the player. So we'll get the player. And we are going to want to put that player into the room that is associated with this room trigger. And this room trigger happens to have a room. And when a room is first born, where's my room? A room has a private player field. We have the ability to set a player. So when a player enters, we're going to say this room dot set player equal to current player. So now the room that's in here now knows that the current player is in this room. But there's another room somewhere on our map that still thinks the player's in there. So before we can let the current room know about the player, we need to have removed that player from the old room. All right. And who knows about that old room? Well, player has the room he's currently in. And we can set that player's room to null. So as a player leaves one room, he's going to forget about the room he was in. And then we're going to add him to the new room. So we'll say current player. Please. I want you to make sure I spell things good. Current player dot set room to null. That will effectively remove the player from their current room. Then we'll take this new room and we'll set the player equal to the current player. Now we can set a player in a room to current player, then have this guy do the logic. So this lets the new room know about the player. We could write into set player the ability to have that guy let the player know about the room they're in. So inside of room, when we're setting a player for the room, we let the room know about the current player, but then we can also let the player know that they are now in this room. So we've updated this player's room to be equal to this, where this is an instance of room. Specifically, it's an instance of the room that is associated with the room trigger that the player, the physical object of the player just interacted with. So when a player rolls into a room, we'll ask core for the current player, because he's the guy who knows about the current data behind the player. Then we'll set that player's room to nothing because he is exiting one room and going into another room. And really, we don't even need this line because it's going to be handled in here. Just turning it to null and then immediately switching it to a new room is kind of a waste of time. We could just flip it from the old value to the new value rather than the old value to null to the new value. So we actually don't need this line. We're just going to have this room set his current player equal to the current player that we got from core. And we didn't need to put this in a variable. We could just say core.getPlayer. So if we prefer, we could just do that. This room set player, core.getPlayer. And then inside the room set player, we set that room's instance of the player equal to the guy we just put in there. And then we let the guy that we just put in there know that the room he's currently sitting in is this particular room, which is presumably a different room than he was just in. And then if we want to do something here, we can say print player now in room this. Let's see, room is, this guy is not a mono behavior, so it doesn't have this print statement. So I'll move it outside of here. I'll move it into my room script. Say player is now in room. This room. So this is my instance of room. We'll take this statement out. So when a player enters a trigger, which is our room trigger, we will remove the player from their old room, put them into the new room, and then we'll announce in the console that the player is now in this new room. And hopefully this gives us a weird memory addressy thing so we can see that the room is changing. All right, let me clear this. Can I make this any bigger down here? Whatever. So run this. Let's see. Objects, so set player P. Oh, it's actually interesting. And just run it one more time, make sure I get the same error. Yeah. Let me show you what's happening there. It's saying that my player P is not set to an instance of an object. My high suspicion here, I say, well, when is a player actually instantiated? It's instantiated with this player script. When this player script starts, this player is created. Now, this player script, this comes down to the time period in which our players are actually created. I'm gonna, let me just prove this first before I say the deal. So I'm going to instantiate my player before this start thing. And let's see if that error goes away real quick before I explain what just went down. Because this will be a common issue. Yeah, that fixed it. Okay. So it is kind of an interesting thing. Let me, so before, so the fix was for me to move new player Mike up here to where I first defined the field instead of putting it down here. Why did that make a difference? Why did it think that this guy did not exist at the moment that we needed him here when a player entered the game object? When I did this, but he's okay with it when I do this. Anybody have a guess as to why moving it up here fixed it? When does the start function get called?
When it's instantiated the first time.
Okay, so that's kind of a, I'm not sure that's the most accurate way of stating it. The player script exists, so he is instantiated prior to start getting called. This guy is a mono behavior. Start gets called when we tell this physical object that's on the screen to start doing stuff. Whereas this gets called right upon his birth, when he first comes into existence, before he starts moving, before he starts doing any of these other things, that stuff is happening. By waiting until start got called here to actually give a value to the player. I'll just show that again here real quick. So I'm commenting out up there. Now I'm actually still setting it. This is what we originally had here. Go back in. We have our error again, hopefully. Are we lucking out now? We're lucking out now. Unless I change the order that the things end up happening when I made that change. Looks like it's working right now, but I think by accident. Effectively, what's happening is this object, and all of these rooms, they're all coming into existence at roughly the same time. Roughly the same time. Well, when we were getting our error before, it was because technically the start method of this particular player was being called slightly after this player collided with this trigger. Therefore, when he collided with the trigger and we tried to ask for that, the instance of the player that already exists, it didn't know about it because the start method had not been called yet. So you do have this game you almost have to play where what is the order in which the stuff in my game comes into existence? Because we have a race. Which existed first? Is it the player object or is it the trigger he's about to hit? And even if the player physically exists, has his start method happened yet? So that does give us kind of a weird timing thing. So I think this is the safer play here to make sure that this guy does exist prior to this start. We're still at the mercy of us not being able to tell core about the player until right here. But it is something to kind of keep in mind as you're doing this stuff. All right, so right now, our players should be keeping track of what room he's in. And as we dance around our game, yeah, see, it's just printing out the word object instead of its memory address, but that's fine. The room that the player is in is getting updated right here. All right, so your homework for Monday, and I'll push this code. Make the rooms and enemy know about where they are on the map, just like we did for players. So you're going to effectively do the exact same thing, except now a room's going to know about what enemy is currently in there, and you could just assume there's a single enemy for right now. And an enemy should also know about what room they're in. All right, questions about what I'm asking you to do? Okay, and hopefully we'll be back in the classroom on Monday, assuming my cough is gone away. I don't want to be hacking all over people. But I generally feel fine now. I just don't sound the greatest. Okay, so questions, comments, concerns, bribes. I will see everybody on Monday. And I'll go ahead and push this code right now.
Can I ask you a quick question just about my own project?
Sure.
So,
Give me 1 second, just so I don't
Sorry.
forget to push it. sure I have everything saved here. That's saved. All of that's saved.